This afternoon's meeting has been called in response to a previous session at which there was a presentation made by Dr. William Keith Morgan on compensation for industrial lung disease. And that meeting, which I unfortunately was not able to attend, provoked sufficient interest such that the Student Association requested, so to speak, equal time. The meeting was originally planned to include a representative and leader of a population group that's very much involved, namely the United Mine Workers of America, and until the last minute, Mr. Arnold Miller, the president of the United Mine Workers, had expected to be here. He sent the following telegram, which was given me a short time ago. I regret very much that due to urgent union business requiring my immediate attention, it is not possible for me to be in Michigan tomorrow as I had planned. It would have been a privilege for me to appear with Dr. Don Rasmussen and with Mr. Ross. Dr. Rasmussen knows more about black lung and has done more to make it a matter of public concern than anyone else in the medical profession. He was one of a small handful of doctors who not only recognized the problem, but were willing to go out among coal miners and describe the situation at a time when most doctors were telling us that coal dust was good for us. It is vitally important that students of public health hear what Dr. Rasmussen and Mr. Ross have to say, particularly now when other physicians are attempting to minimize the significance of this disease. Like hundreds of thousands of other miners, I have black lung, and thanks to the education I received from Dr. Rasmussen and his colleagues, no one can ever again tell me that my troubles come from cigarette smoking or some other disease not connected with my occupation. I know better. Dr. Rasmussen knows better. M.H. Ross knows better. And no one in the United States is better suited to the task of describing black lung than these two men. Again, I regret very much that I cannot be with you today. Yours very truly, Arnold Miller, President, United Mine Workers of America. By way of further introduction of our speakers, let me indicate to you that Dr. Rasmussen is a graduate of the University of Utah College of Medicine, is a specialist in internal medicine recognized by the American Board of Internal Medicine, has had specialty training in pulmonary diseases in a variety of research centers, and at the present time serves as chief of the pulmonary section of the Appalachian Regional Hospital in Beckley, West Virginia, one of the keystones of that network of hospitals in Appalachia that the United Mine Workers succeeded in building. He has a very impressive list of publications in the field of miners' pulmonary diseases and pulmonary physiology, and his work that was alluded to in Mr. Miller's telegram was recognized when, in 1969, he was given an American Public Health Association Presidential Award for his exceptional public service in the fight against black lung. Along with Dr. Rasmussen, we're very pleased to have Mr. M.H. Ross, who at the present time is administrator of an outstanding clinic, the Fairmont Clinic, which is a multi-specialist group practice, and as we've come to expect from people who run such organizations, is in the forefront of healthcare delivery. His clinic, for example, serves as the largest home health agency in the entire state of West Virginia, and is noted for its wide use of physician extenders and nurse practitioners. Mr. Ross has a very broad experience, not only in the field of healthcare administration, but has served as a labor organizer, and closely associated with the work of the miners, and currently serves as a member of the Board of Directors of Group Health Association of America. Dr. Rasmussen will open up the discussion, and he will be followed by Mr. Ross, and we would ask that you hold your questions or comments until both of the presentations have been made. They have assured me that while their remarks will be replete with information and interest, they will leave time for plenty of questions and discussion from the floor. It's nice to see this kind of blend of quote scientific and quote political points of view brought to bear on a problem that is of widespread concern and public health interest. I'd like to commend the Student Public Health Association for their activities in making this kind of program possible. Without further ado then, Dr. Rasmussen.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm glad to have the opportunity to come here and talk to you about a problem that I've contended with daily for the past 10 or 11 years. My involvement with the problem of lung disease in coal miners started shortly after I arrived in Beckley, West Virginia, back when that was one of the Miners Memorial Hospital Association facilities that the Union had built to take care of people in the Appalachian Mountains. At any rate, I began to encounter fairly large numbers of coal miners who complained of shortness of breath. And the shortness of breath they complained about was severe. These men, for example, if they had to climb a flight of stairs before retiring for the night, would have to get to the top of the stairs and sit on the bed for several moments to get their breath before they could even undress. Or if they were working in a mine, they'd have to stop every perhaps 50 to 100 feet and rest from the stoop position where they were crawling. Or if they had to go out and get a little bucket of coal for the fire, they'd have to stop 2 or 3 times just carrying a small bucket of coal into the house. So that these people had significant shortness of breath with effort that was really bothersome. Interestingly enough, some of these people were being seen by psychiatrists, and the psychiatrists most often made a diagnosis of anxiety tension state. Now, the reason that these people were being seen by the psychiatrists was that they had been evaluated by otherwise very competent internal medicine specialists who had taken note of the history of shortness of breath, had done a physical examination which wasn't very often revealing, had gotten a chest x-ray which might reveal minimal pneumoconiosis, and then had done a simple spirometric breathing test and found that this was normal, and therefore concluded that there was no organic basis for shortness of breath in these individuals, and they were therefore referred to the psychiatrist for study. Actually, to the credit of some of the psychiatrists, it was not assumed by most of the psychiatrists that their shortness of breath was related to emotional problems. Some of the psychiatrists believed fully that this problem had an organic basis. One psychiatrist commented about one patient who said, "Why, that man has to climb 2 flights of steps before he can come to our clinic, and when he gets to the top, he's blue in the face and all out of breath, and we have to give him oxygen for about 10 minutes before he'll calm down." So there was some general recognition that something wasn't right here. At any rate, this kind of situation with this type of patient wasn't unknown, and in fact, we had frequently encountered patients with a variety of odd lung diseases who complained of symptoms of shortness of breath, and yet who had normal ventilatory studies. In other words, a normal ability to move air in and out through the airways. And we routinely proceeded in such cases to do additional kinds of testing. And primarily we did testing aimed at evaluating how efficiently an individual could oxygenate his blood, how efficiently he could transfer oxygen from the lungs into the blood. And very quickly we began to encounter miners in whom that we found rather marked impairment in the ability to transfer oxygen. By way of examples of this type of abnormality, perhaps we could have the slides that we brought. I've got cases of 3 coal miners from those that we studied during January and February of this year in the laboratory. Actually, we studied some 376 coal miners with complete studies during that 2-month period. We encountered 25 that must be considered to have sufficiently severe impairment in function that one could classify these people as being disabled. The first man, as you can see, was employed for 32 years working at a place where you would expect to have rather high concentrations of coal dust. And you can see his symptoms began about 6 years ago. This man never smoked cigarettes in his life. His x-ray shows simple pneumoconiosis and nothing more. The values here are, first of all, the forced vital capacity. That's the total amount of air that he can exhale from a deep inspiration. The forced expiratory volume in 1 second is that amount of air that he can get out of his lungs in the first second that he performs the test. And the maximum breathing capacity is the amount that he can breathe in 1 minute. Well, you can see that his forced vital capacity and his 1 second vital capacity are entirely normal. His maximum breathing capacity is almost normal. Certainly, you couldn't account for any of his symptoms of shortness of breath on the basis of these findings. Now, if we may have the next slide. When we put him on the treadmill and exercised him, you can see that first of all, he exercised at perhaps a moderate exercise level. In other words, with an oxygen consumption of 1.37 liters per minute. One of the characteristic things, observations that we make is that in the relationship between the oxygen consumption and the amount of air that he breathed, or his minute volume, we expect in the normal individual to have in the range of 20 to 30. You notice that his was considerably higher than that, the range around 42. The next value, labeled the A to A oxygen gradient, that's the difference between the oxygen in the lung and the oxygen in the arterial blood. You can see that while the normal we would expect roughly a range like this, his is almost 50 millimeters of mercury, which is quite abnormal. His arterial oxygen tension, again, the normal range was 75 to 95 millimeters of mercury, and here his at 54 millimeters of mercury. Another test that we find useful is a fractional uptake of carbon monoxide. In other words, the percent of carbon monoxide that the man breathes in test gas should be in this range of 0.4 to 0.6. His was considerably reduced down to 0.16, His steady state diffusing capacity predicted was 19.4, and as you can see, his was 9.7. So that I think this is pretty clear indication that this miner has significant impairment in his ability to oxygenate his blood. Let's have the next slide, please. This is another man. He worked primarily as a motorman. He'd had symptoms for about the same length of time. This man was a cigarette smoker. He'd smoked half a pack of cigarettes daily for 23 years. His x-ray revealed simple pneumoconiosis. Now, again, his forced vital capacity, 1 second vital capacity, and maximum breathing capacity are entirely normal. If we can have the next set. Here again on exercise, he overbreathed rather markedly. He exhibited, again, marked impairment in his ability to transfer oxygen. He was hypoxic. He did have a reduction in his fractional carbon monoxide uptake and some reduction in his steady state diffusing capacity. Now we could have the next one. Here's a man that worked for 20 years in a coal preparation plant. Now, there hasn't been much said in all the problems of coal miners about the preparation plant. This is not underground. This is in the surface. Well, there must be something very wrong in this particular preparation plant. The men tell me that it's very, very smoky. I mean, dusty in this mine. I mean, in this preparation plant. We've evaluated approximately 20 people who worked here, and fully 50% of them show this same type of abnormality in lung function. Here again, minimal reduction in forced vital capacity. By the way, his x-ray didn't reveal any evidence of pneumoconiosis. He's also a lifelong non-smoker. Now if we could have the next slide. Here again, he exhibited rather marked impairment in oxygen transfer with a widened A-to-A gradient, reduced PO2, fractional CO uptake, and diffusing capacity. He didn't overventilate as markedly as the other gentleman did. At any rate, I think that's the last of the slides. During the 2-month period between in January and February of this year, we encountered 25 miners with this type of abnormality. With one exception, there were 6 who did have minimal ventilatory impairment. There were 3 who had moderate to severe ventilatory impairment out of that 25. But 16 of them had perfectly normal ventilatory function. 22 of them showed simple pneumoconiosis by X-ray. 2 showed no definite evidence of coal workers' pneumoconiosis. And 1 showed category B complicated pneumoconiosis, or the so-called progressive massive fibrosis. There were 6 who had smoked, had a smoking history of 30 pack years or greater. In other words, 1 pack of cigarettes a day for 30 years or more. Let's say there were 6 of those. There were 9 who had had between 15 and 29 pack years of smoking. There were 5 between 1 and 14 pack years of smoking, and 4 were lifelong non-smokers. Now, in addition to this 25 with very severe impairment in oxygen transfer, there were 34 others who had at least moderately severe impairment in respiratory function. I didn't bother to break down their findings related to, in relationship to X-rays. Needless to say, of the 376, for some reason, we only found 2 cases of complicated pneumoconiosis, which is just by chance. Now, don't get the idea that what I'm telling you is a representative sample of coal miners in our part of the country even, because these people were selected. We studied more of these because they did not have X-ray evidence of complicated pneumoconiosis. We studied more men like this because they had normal ventilatory functions. So this is not a representative sample of coal miners. But the point that I want to make is that we do have sizable numbers of coal miners in the southern Appalachians who have disabling lung disease, who do not have complicated pneumoconiosis, and who are not cigarette smokers, and whose impairment in lung function must reasonably be attributed to the occupation of coal mining. Now, I also want to make a point of pointing out that the mere finding of pneumoconiosis on an X-ray in no way implies any loss of function in a coal miner. And this I'll go so far as to say, even including some coal miners who have complicated pneumoconiosis or progressive massive fibrosis. On any number of occasions when we've had a group of 10 or 12 miners going through our studies during a day, we'll find that the healthiest miner might have a category B complicated pneumoconiosis. So far as we're concerned, we see no relationship whatsoever between an X-ray, the findings on the X-ray, and the respiratory function, either ventilatory function or oxygen transfer capacity. Some people that have been critical of some of the things we've said become very disturbed when we say disabling lung disease can occur in coal miners who have no more than simple pneumoconiosis. But we're not trying to say that every coal miner with simple pneumoconiosis is disabled. And I think that's a distinction that should be made. At any rate, this is the pattern that we see. We see coal miners who are working. There are problems that they have. They're symptomatic. They may be, say, under the age of 55 years. They know that to continue their employment is bad. In other words, they realize that the continued exposure to dust is going to make them worse. They have a problem, though. They don't dare quit their employment because they have no guarantee of any. First of all, there's no alternative employment. There's no other industry. They can't go across the street and get a job. They can't even come up here to Detroit and get a job because somebody's going to examine them and say, no, you don't pass the medical examination, because many of them have been here and have come back. So basically, these men have to continue to work until someone can assure them that they are sufficiently disabled that they'll qualify for some kind of benefits. So it's a very, very poor situation. And of course, we would hope that the problem of dust exposure in the coal mines would have been solved by now. And if you listen to the Bureau of Mines, you would believe that the problem has been solved. But last Sunday, I was invited to a meeting of a local union in on the Virginia-West Virginia border area, in which they invited an official from the agency that's supposed to safeguard the dust levels of miners to point out that indeed the dust levels were not under control in that mine, in spite of what the Bureau of Mines had to say. So the problem still exists. It hasn't been solved. We're still going to see miners who are disabled until the proper enforcement is instigated. Well, I think I'll conclude my remarks with that now and turn the time over to Mr. Ross.
Dr. Axelrod, Dr. Rasmussen, and ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to be here today and grateful to the Graduate Student Association for the invitation which has been extended to both of us. It's probably a tribute to the spirit of free speech or participation by students that events such as this are able to take place in your university. I'm going to comment more sharply about some of the political issues and not deal at all, since I have no scientific training, with the scientific issues which have been presented here and were presented in December to you by Dr. Morgan, not in an experimental way about laboratory animals, but about human beings who dig for their living underground and who provide the air conditioning, the lights, and the heat for the United States and its people. Dr. Rasmussen is a physician who lives daily amongst coal miners, examines them daily for coal workers' pneumoconiosis, performs sophisticated and elaborate testing procedures, and with the late Dr. I.E. Buff, who died about 10 days ago, went into the hollows, rural counties, and coal camps starting about 10 years ago to educate coal miners to what then the medical profession denied was a problem. A majority of physicians in this country for 125 years denied the existence of a disease entity known as coal workers' pneumoconiosis. And he played a major role as a physician and a person in stimulating the mass movement that resulted in the first major piece of legislation in behalf of Federal Coal Mine Health and Safety Act in the United States, which resulted in a mass movement of Black Lung Association, disabled miners and widows, and ultimately a rank-and-file movement inside the United Mine Workers of America, which resulted in the election of Arnold Miller as president of that organization. And Arnold Miller, son and grandson of miners, who entered the mines at age 16, is today not only a victim of black lung, but the rank-and-file leader of at least one clean, democratic United States labor organization. In December, Dr. Morgan was invited and came to you, and somebody has got a lot of money because there's a very slick paper publication out in a big hurry. I've delivered a few papers on invitation, and they take forever to get anything done. Either this organization doesn't know what to do with its money, or it works very fast from the time a person delivers the speech and it gets inside of slick covers. This is known as the Baker Lecture. At the point that Dr. Morgan spoke to you, he was the paid director of Alfred, paid a salary by the United States government to be the director of Alfred, Appalachian Laboratory for Research into Occupational Respiratory Diseases, financed by Health, Education, and Welfare and NIOSH. On April 1, he was no longer the director. And we are meeting today on April 3. What sense of outrage, besides the resolution that was mailed to me, might have taken place amongst students who listened to that lecture in December? I have read it, and I've listened to it on tape. Fortunately, the tape can't be erased. There's no 18-minute missing sector. The tape speaks for itself. It speaks of snobbery. It speaks of a stance of looking down. It speaks louder than the written page in black and white. Those of you that haven't heard it, it's a graduate education. listen to it and learn to read between the lines. But let me help your examination of that. He came to Michigan where there are no coal miners, where people do not know coal miners. He who was on the federal payroll heading an agency by statute delegated to defend and protect and do research upon the health of coal miners attacked coal miners on their black lung benefits. This insensitive physician attack on coal miners was done without any understanding of two major factors. And it's a footnote and a parenthesis to add that nothing in medical education equips physicians to go into the kitchen where the heat is, as Harry Truman says, and if they move into the political arena, they're going to get some heat, so they better be educated either in political science or in sensitivities before they go to med school. I know of nothing in medical school that trains them on these sensitivities. First, what was the first factor? That coal miners come up in a particular socio-economic political setting, and the older miners in the mines today and those pensioned were raised in concentration camps all over Appalachia, the only concentration camps on the American continent. The black coal miners were brought into Appalachia to break strikes from Alabama and Georgia in boxcars. The southern and eastern European immigrants were brought in as feudal serfs, not speaking the language, all of them there to destroy each other, to break each other's strikes. And the miracle of it is that somehow brotherhood of man was taught to them, not by the intellectuals, not by the faculties of famous universities, but by the United Mine Workers of America, starting in the 20s, defeated time and again until they built a union. Let me try to give you the setting, because occasionally humane doctors get me an invitation before a bunch of doctors, and I try to educate them a little bit on these issues, and I'd like to share with you some of these issues. Nothing I'm telling you is not written down in 100 sociological and historical documents. The coal miner in Appalachia was molded in this kind of socio-economic political setting from before World War I and continuing until the mid-1930s. Most of Appalachia was an arena for continual class warfare. America's last rugged frontier was not in the far west but here. The older miners now working or pensioned were raised in conditions of civil conflict, brutality, starvation, terrorism, and family degradation. Until the 1930s, mine owner dominance of the lives of coal workers and their families was complete. The owners created the mining town of necessity, and the operator provided housing in the form of company houses in rows, the company store, the water supply, the sanitation, the police services, the post office, voting rights in quotes, medical care, such hospital as there might be, the school, the church, the theater, and the burial services. And all of it by wage deduction, and all of it under the control of the company. There wasn't only what I named, there was blacklisting. There were labor spies. There was mass eviction of families who joined the union. Company ownership of meeting places, streets, and public roads, as the miners repeatedly attempted to organize. The struggles that resulted were the bloodiest and the violent annals of American labor history. I say that, number one, you care to talk about coal miners, then you better know your people. Have some compassion. Have some understanding. Don't come from far away into Appalachia to tell them and go to Michigan to say in your first words in the speech here, I am from the slag heaps of West Virginia. Maybe West Virginia isn't almost heaven, as the song says, but it's at least a place of decent human beings who care and who work very hard. Point two, second factor. Dr. Morgan showed no appreciation, although he's the federal official in charge, for an understanding of how we got the Federal Coal Mine Health and Safety Act of 1969. Were conditions any worse in 1969 than in 68, or 10 years before, or 50 years before? No. They were miserable at all times. Then how did we get the act? I live 7 miles from Farmington number 9. And at 5:45 that morning, I was awakened, probably the first person outside the mine, the first person in the community. I had to notify the sheriff's office. I had to mobilize the medical forces because a person at one of the ventilation shafts saw the entire multi-hundred-ton structure blown into the air and knew that an explosion had taken place in one of the biggest American mines, Farmington number 9. 78 men were buried alive. Most of them are still in the mine, and their bodies have not yet been recovered. That was 7 miles from where I live. Our doctors were there when the 8 men who were brought out alive in a bucket were examined. Our nurses, our social workers, our paramedical personnel were there with their tranquilizers, with their comfort, with everything, with the families for the 10 days of the disaster. 10 days before they sealed the mine. 7 miles in the other direction lies Monongah. In 1907, the worst mine disaster in U.S. history took place at Monongah. They found 362 bodies. The debate is whether there were 400 men, 500, or 1,000 in the mine. But it was the worst disaster in the bodies they found. That's in the same county, in one county in Appalachia. And I'm not listing all the other disasters. What's that got to do with politics? It's got everything to do with it. Because in between 1907 and the 1968 Farmington disaster, the media had changed. And what happened on November 20th and every night, whether it was Walter Cronkite or NBC News or ABC News or BBC, is that American and world television viewers saw Farmington number 9 blowing up every night for 10 days. A mushroom cloud that wasn't Alamogordo on a desert somewhere. There were people here. And in between, the cameras closed in, and the widows, the would-be widows, about to be widows, and the children and all the people involved were on national TV. And that was why we got legislation within months in the West Virginia legislature, which had up till then been controlled by the coal operators. That was why the American public reacted, and a congressional statute was passed. I think that when one wanders onto the political stage, one better have some idea of what's going on. What a little bit of history and a little bit of people knowledge. Now, what else must one have besides those two factors before one talks about coal miners and develops theories about their compensation, which is to take away from coal miners their hard-won benefits? In 1971, I was invited to the International Conference on Coal Workers' Pneumoconiosis, the only layman, I think, or at least maybe not PhD anatomist or something there. And as usual, I was to speak on the way of life of the Appalachian coal miner. It appeared on the third day of talking about FEV1 and FEV2 and statistics. And then it appeared as a subhead under extent and distribution of disease. So you can imagine I tried to get in a couple of punches for humanity. Now, I'm just excerpting from what I said to this medical audience, sponsored by the New York Academy of Sciences. And I'd like to just give you a short excerpt of how differently a miner and a physician viewed dust. The miner's awareness of the hazards of dust is evident in their folkways and their union actions. One coal miner's song around 1900 dealt directly with this danger. I used to be a drill man till it got the best of me. It killed 2 fellow workers here at Old Parlee. And now I've eaten so much dust, Lord, that it is killing me. In a 1913 poem, melodramatically addressed to, quote, ye who sit in luxury's lap and ye who ride in state, the minor writer asked, do you ever think of our gruesome lives or bemoan our children's fate? And he described coal miners with backs bent low and lungs beclogged with dust. Mark you, at no point had the medical profession admitted what the Scottish physicians in 1807 and 1828 and 1830 had called attention to: black lung, the danger of coal dust. This was 100 years later, and they were absolutely parading its great advances and how healthy coal miners were. There was nothing wrong with them. As Dr. Rasmussen pointed out, it's a common thing to ship them off to psychiatrists, was the trick of it, until they began to reverse themselves. In 1936, a West Virginia miners' local wrote to the International Convention, we all know that 30% of the miners are afflicted with miners' asthma, caused by breathing air currents laden with coal dust. That same year, a Kentucky miner described his life in Dark Hollow in vivid terms, quote, we are 6 brothers, all 6 feet. We mine coal. Miles back into the bowels of the mountain we burrow. Our days are lived in the dark, bent in a strained crouch. Bodies as black as that coal, lungs the color of mashed pokeberries. We breathe black air, we spit black spit. This is before Dr. Goff sectioned lungs in South Wales. And when I visited him in South Wales, he used the same terminology. It looks like mashed pokeberries. That's what the lungs looked like. This was a miner describing just his impressions of things before the doctors admitted this. Perhaps the miner who wrote the song, Sprinkle Coal Dust on My Grave, in the federal collection, was sending as pointedly playful a message to physicians as the hypochondriac who asked that his tombstone read, I told you so. For many years, little, if any, notice was given to the illnesses of miners, to their dusty work environment, or to the real symptoms they presented. When increasing mine mechanization raised dust levels, physicians repeated the then standard statements that coal dust was, quote, among the least harmful dusts, end quote. These are all medical journals. Longevity and coal mining go together because of, quote, the peculiar properties of a coal mine beneficial to the miner's lungs. The reason for the scientific lag is uncertain. Perhaps physicians had failed to heed Osler's advice. Listen to the patient. He is diagnosing himself. For miners were hardly unaware of shortness of breath, morning cough, black spittle, crushing disability, early old age, usually called miner's asthma. If you study occupational medicine here, you know, you really ought to have this as required reading if you don't. But the teenage tunnel worker in the novel Hawk's Nest is really a kind of epidemiologist, because when no one seems to know why the men are dying at Gauley Bridge, which should be, if you are in graduate school, one of your great points of education on occupational medicine, where men died within 6 months of silicosis in drilling the tunnel near where the legendary John Henry went through in West Virginia. But this teenager in the novel says, this almost unknown novel, Hawk's Nest, "Ma, I've been thinking a lot," he said. "It's funny how all them fellas working at the tunnel are dying. I've been over and over it in my head, Ma. There must be some reason besides the cough. If it was pneumonia, it seems like women folk would get it, and the little ones. Sitting here and hearing the ambulances every day, I get to thinking, now I got the trouble, and Pa's got it, and Mark, he coughs some too. But you and Viney, you ain't never had it. That's a funny thing, don't you think, Ma?" Well, physicians better get back, and the wheel, as Michael John said in the British Medical Journal, has to turn a whole 100 years back to where they were in the early 19th century in recognizing something of black lung. Now, in the last 5, 6, 8, or 10 years, there's been increasing majority recognition in the medical profession. It's become the in thing to hold meetings on pneumoconiosis, to recognize that it is a disease entity. What we're dealing with in the Baker lecture in December is that an attack is made here, fundamentally not so much on the minors, that's secondary, as on the congressional presumption. The congressional statute, first of all in 1969, recognized coal workers' pneumoconiosis. And in the 72 amendments, it did two things. It stated that a negative X-ray would not bar a man from it being evidence of pneumoconiosis. Now that's Congress talking. And secondly, there'd be a presumption run in his favor if he had worked 15 years underground in an underground mine, and if he had a respiratory disease. Dr. Morgan, you see, is quarreling with the Congress of the United States, as he might well do, and they do in Mississippi, about minimum wages. But he better be open about what his quarrel's about. He's quarreling with that presumption. And I would like you to consider the social legislation here, that a nation has a right to say, not only that a man who serves in the military for 20 years gets a benefit for life, or not only that we presume if you serve in the military and you come out with a disability that the military gave it to you or aggravated it, but it can say about its coal miners, and note the distinction, not in strip mining, but in the dusty environment without air of an underground mine, that 15 years underground, there'll be a presumption about any respiratory disease he has being connected with his occupation. So you see, when you leave the laboratory in experimental animals, the people out there have some rights too, and you don't tread all over them. They have a right to lobby their congressmen and to have the American people, through the Congress, grant presumptions. And I say to you that it's a hell of a lot more fair in the United States to give a coal miner who risked his life daily for 15 or more years digging coal for this country a presumption than it is to give some supply sergeant out in Kansas and a National Guard armory a pension after 20 years. And yet we do the latter, and there isn't a darn argument out of Dr. Morgan or the rest of them. And there ought to be some decent attitudes on these humane questions that don't color themselves as scientific research and scientific discussion. A man got down into politics, and he got into the kitchen. If he can't stand the heat, let him get out. I'd like to close by saying there are really three final comments. One, America never made progress in the American political tradition except by not splitting its working class on social legislation. a section of the working class goes forward, as in every nation, and gets better conditions, and then it brings along another section up to that level. And in the Morgan speech, he posed the North Carolina textile worker. Pity the unorganized textile worker in North Carolina who, disabled with brown lung, only gets 1/3 the benefit of the Kentucky coal miner. Let us have compassion for him. Let us bring him up through federalization and minimum standards for workmen's compensation to decent levels, not by tearing down the benefits that coal miners have won. You do not raise the minimum wage by detracting from the construction workers, the iron workers' $9 an hour wage. You instead bring up a $1.60 worker to $2.30. You bring people forward. There's an uneven development in social legislation in our country, and throughout our history we have come forward in uneven ways and not by logic. And to deal with this in a logical way is ridiculous. And my second point would ask you by analogy to see, would you oppose Medicare? Not for its stupidities. Would you oppose the principle of benefits for the over 65 when everyone in this room knows how ridiculous it is to cover medical benefits for the over 65 when we do not give free medical care to those under 6 who are our future citizens? Do we thereby say that because the children of the country do not have guaranteed Social Security floor for their care, we take away from those over 65? But it's illogical, and that's what the attack was being made on, another section of the common people. Lastly, I do not know what graduate education is supposed to teach, but I would hope that it at least teaches the obligation of those who are educated, who have college education and postgraduate education, and who gain wealth and status, to be generous towards the working class and the poor. I do not think one should use his platform to attack sections of the working class who are not able to speak for themselves, who do not have colleagues in the audience, who do not have a capability of response, except as your student movement provided that capability here. And I would hope that the lesson of this whole thing is not that there is an individual named Morgan about whom I could care neither less nor more, but rather that the next director of Alfred, let us determine, shall be a humane physician, scientifically trained and enlightened on the social and political and American tradition issues. Thank you. See what I did to him? I never used one of these.
The floor is open for comments, questions, discussion.
Dr. Appalachia?
Yes.
I have one question for Dr. I'm quoting out of our block. The point that brought out Dr. Williams was really, one of the focal points to concern about the while the degree of justice goes to seem to make little difference in the prevalence of bronchitis and smoking, a significant effect is apparent in non-smokers. A slight decrease in ventilatory capacity is also associated with increased dust exposure, but here the effects of cigarette smoking outweigh the effects of dust by about 5 to 1. What he has said there is that he talks about various jobs associated with mining coal. And he says with smokers, there appears to be no difference in the amount of disability regardless of the type of job. But with non-smokers, there was a variation. And then he concludes that the reason that we saw that variation was that cigarette smoking was a predominant factor in those that showed no difference regardless of the job. What is your comment on that statement?
Well, on the specific point that he was making, I think was based on some studies which they did relative to the acute effects of dust exposure. In other words, they tested miners, I think, before and after they went into a mine, and they found that there were decreases in ventilatory function following, in other words, immediately following the exposure. And if he is saying that there was no effect on smokers, but a significant effect on non-smokers, I don't see how he can then say that cigarette smoking was 5 times as important in the overall picture as dust. Now, frankly, cigarette smoking is very harmful for coal miners. There's no argument about that. I tell coal miners it's worse for them to smoke perhaps than for non-coal miners to smoke. But I'm certainly not willing to say that cigarette smoking is 5 times as big a factor as the dust in coal mines. I think that's totally unrealistic.
Yes.
Dr. Rasmussen, in your lecture, Morgan talked at some points about industrial bronchitis, what he called industrial bronchitis, at some points about obstructive airway disease, at other points about black lung, and other points about co-workers in pneumoconiosis. Could you kind of separate out for us which of those terms means anything and which do not?
Well, among chronic obstructive lung diseases, chronic bronchitis is probably the major disease. It is a disease which produces obstruction to the airways. Other conditions that can cause and lead to obstructive airway disease, of course, are certain kinds of emphysema. But when he talks about chronic bronchitis and obstructive lung disease, he's basically talking about the same kind of disease. I agree with him that he's not talking about pneumoconiosis. I think that coal miners get chronic bronchitis. I think they get their chronic bronchitis as a consequence of the total impact on their respiratory tree from their cigarette smoking, air pollution, and the dust and other substances in coal mines. And you know, coal miners are not subject only to dust exposure. There are certain other noxious gases that no one really talks about, but there's certainly oxides of nitrogen. Some people are subjected to breathing certain types of oils or hydrocarbons, various different products that miners breathe. And there's no question in my mind, and I think there are other people who recognize that coal miners as a group have more chronic bronchitis than non-coal miners. But that's still a different disease than the pneumoconiosis. Now, the pneumoconiosis as such probably produces the impairment in lung function, not specifically because of what you would see in terms of looking at a microscopic section of a lung or looking at a chest x-ray of a lung. One study that was reported by Dr. Noya, who was a pathologist in the University of Pennsylvania at Hershey, Pennsylvania, was a study which I thought was very interesting because it corresponded quite well to what we find in the laboratory. He studied almost 300 autopsies of coal miners, and he obtained histories on these people, and he found that if he divided them into 2 groups, into those who did have a history of shortness of breath with exertion, and those who did not, and then he looked at the various anatomical findings that he made, he found that he couldn't tell the difference between those with and those without shortness of breath based on the number the size, the distribution, and the content of nodules, or in other words, of pneumoconiosis. What he did find was he found an increase in right ventricular, right heart enlargement and emphysema. He found a greater incidence of emphysema, in other words, abnormal airspace. In other words, the ones who had shortness of breath had more lung tissue destruction than the others. They also did have more evidence of chronic bronchitis, but the main difference was in the amount of emphysema. And of course, this I might point out, is that you do not see, or you do not readily detect emphysema on a chest X-ray. So at any rate, this sort of corresponds to our thinking that the pneumoconiosis itself may not really be the problem. And as a matter of fact, the emphysema may develop, let's say, independently from the pneumoconiosis as such. You know, we've seen our pathologist, Dr. Werner LeCour at the hospital of Beckley, has probably prepared more Goff sections and seen more post-mortem studies on coal miners than anybody else in this country. And going through some of his material, you can see again this disparity between the nodules, the things which you might see on a chest X-ray, and the general status of the lung tissue itself. In other words, he can show you coal miners where you'll have a large number of very clear, very discrete, solid nodular densities. But if you look at the lung tissue between those nodules, it may be perfectly well preserved and just as normal as anything could be. Whereas other cases in which you don't really encounter any sizable number of nodules, you may have virtually no remaining lung tissue, and yet you will find nothing that would really cast a shadow on an X-ray. And as long as we're on that, the whole business of what I consider to be superstition on the part of the medical profession about complicated pneumoconiosis. It's ridiculous to go around and say that that a man would be considered to be disabled if he had, let's say, a mass density even as big around as your fist. When you look at the size of that fist compared to a volume of lung like this, you certainly can't see how that nodule that size could be responsible for producing disability. Now, he might have disability, but it's certainly caused from what else is going on throughout the rest of his lungs, not just in this nodule. Has that more than answered your question?
Yes. Doctor, can you describe some of the countermeasures that are now taking place in the mind, either some kind of a personal mask or ventilation system to protect him from?
Well, the main thrust in the 1969 Act is to increase ventilation. In other words, if they can blow enough air across the face to actually remove the dust that's created, this is the main way that it's done. Now, there's nothing in the law particularly specifying a mask, and actually there were two reasons why some of us felt like this was not the way to go. In the first place, no one really knows how effective any of the present day masks, the little filter things, are. In the second place, we were concerned that this would simply be an excuse, in other words, for them not to control the dust. Now, there is one, and that there are probably more than this, but I'm aware of one industrialist who is developing a special type of breathing apparatus in which filtered air is pumped into a face mask apparatus, but that's in the development stage. This, I think, would be the ideal way to go, in addition to the dust control itself.
Yeah.
Mr. Rose, the prospect of some kind of uniform working compensation, and also the point that Dr. Morgan made that my owners don't contribute to paying for the presence.
I don't pretend to any expertise in federalization of minimum standards. I think they'd be a good development. I think that this year, it's reported from Washington that one of the major thrusts of the large body of organized labor, AFL-CIO, will be to have, especially in a Senate committee, major legislation introduced to set minimum state standards. There's much worse than the discrepancy that Dr. Morgan focused on, like what the problem is not who gets the most, say that coal miners can get a black lung benefit. The problem is simply this, that of the 50 states, in 23 of them, the minimum weekly benefit under workman's compensation is below the poverty level. That's the simplest way to state the sharpness of the situation. And if you want to see politics at work, Texas provides a minimum benefit of $49 a week, say for a family of 4, which is the lowest in the country. The Texas oil companies, let's say the greediest, are buying up the grubbiest. They're buying up the coal industry of Appalachia. What we're seeing, and you're seeing it in full-page ads now, is this new concern. The oil companies are interested in us, not in their stockholders, in us doing this about conservation, in the greatness of America in the future, and in energy steps. I think what we're dealing with is a major thrust in politics, that we've got to beat back these big companies who have, through the chambers of commerce and other lobbyists, have prevented in the various states decent levels of compensation for injured workmen. We're talking about a guy losing both of his legs, both of his arms, getting $49 a week in the state of Texas. The problem is not whether some coal miner gets $284 a month or something. That's not the issue. I don't see arguing whether an iron worker makes $9 an hour when I say it's deplorable that somebody can't live on $1.60, an hour. We've got to bring people up. And I don't know any way to do it except through minimum standards in the Congress. On your second point, we're in a very messy situation on the black lung law and the amendments, the Federal Coal Mine Health and Safety Act. What happened was the nation, in a sort of guilt sense, after the Farmington disaster, provided in an interim way, the Congress thought, like they get into many things. They would provide for black lung benefits until the states brought up their laws. Then they would dump over onto the states. What we've got is, Dr. Rasmussen and I were talking before the meeting in answer to Dr. Axelrod, we don't know, either of us, of a single state that has brought its legislation up to the federal standards. But it is a misstatement to state that you can draw both federal black lung benefits, as Dr. Morgan said in his speech, and workman's compensation. The federal law is clear on this. There's a set-off of dollar for dollar, and that was not stated in that speech. It was stated that you could draw, and he named both categories of money that a Kentucky coal miner could draw. There is a set-off. Now, the only way we're going to get the coal operators is to have the Congress end this legislation, in the sense of drift it over onto the states, force it on to the backs of Consolidation Coal, Peabody Coal, the huge corporate entities. Now, for the most part, the conglomerates are owned by the oil companies, and see that they pay out of their huge profits for this compensatory measure that's necessary, I believe.
May I add one word here? There's been a lot of comment on the coal industry talking about what a terrible burden it's going to be forced to shoulder. But the coal industry will not have to pick up the tab on those people who have been given federal black lung compensation awards. They only have to be concerned about those miners who are currently employed who will subsequently become disabled. There are only 150,000 working coal miners now. So you see, their burden isn't all that great.
Yes, last question.
Are there any coal miners that are working now or formerly worked who are not covered by federal standards for either black lung or other disabilities?
Do you mean coal miners who are not now receiving benefits?
Are there any, for example, coal miners who stopped working 10 years ago who aren't covered
Well, any coal mine, there's no statute of limitations so far as the federal coal mines statutes are concerned. Part of the reason for that was that many of the victims of lung disease in states who were never compensated had long since passed their the cutoff time. So there's no limitation. If that's your question.
The only thing I can think of is I think it requires 6 months in the mines, but no years on it. Is that correct? I think there's a minimum. In other words, we get applicants daily coming through that may have quit working in the mines in 1918, after 2 years. They may have been doing something else entirely, so that if they can provide evidence, you see, they don't get the presumption running in their favor for them unless they got 15 years. But they can be an applicant if they can prove out a positive case.
Last question, yes.
I'm Dr. Dents. I'm here because I happen to be a member of the organization that fights Dr. Morgan. I'm a coordinator between Michigan Fractional Society and the Michigan Lung Association. I cannot speak for them, I speak as an individual. I guess I'm most distressed by the fact that I feel Dr. Morgan's statement has been misinterpreted. And I think we would like to return to the facts of the issue. The facts are available for students to read. The lecture has not been printed. I'm greatly distressed that Dr. Morgan is attacked on the basis of humanity because he devoted a lifetime to serving humanity. First as a physician, directly dealing with patients, and then secondly, and more recently as a researcher. He has tried to investigate the facts and has the courage to stand up and state the facts as he saw them. Those facts are available for review. His articles have been published in scientific journals. I think it's perhaps infinitely more humane to be able to stand up when you're a federal employee and state the facts as you have found them, even though they happen to be unpopular. And that's what he has done. I think Mr. Ross has even agreed with his basic premise. As I read his article, the main thing he was stressing that day was that disability in civilized society should be compensated, and should be compensated equally, regardless of cause. So we don't have to talk to a steel worker from Pennsylvania or an auto worker from Michigan that his legs severed building our automobiles. That his compensation is worth only a half or a third of what a migrant worker's compensation is. Also, considerable criticism has dealt with the problem of how much damage is done by cigarette smoke. I think this is a very important issue. It should not be hidden under the carpet. Because indeed, if cigarette smoke is 4 or 5 times more important than coal dust, shouldn't the mine workers know that? Shouldn't the cigarette companies be attacked? I happen to be in pulmonary business also, and every day I also see workers and non-workers who are disabled. Except the common factor there is that they're not mine workers, they're cigarette smokers. And for the cases that Dr. Rasmussen has shown us, I can likewise show you similar cases damaged by cigarette smoke. I do want to congratulate Dr. Rasmussen. He has been a leader in presenting the difficulties of the miner to the medical profession. He pointed out the importance of looking at other parameters besides merely ambulatory functions and improving the medical understanding of these diseases. But I likewise see Dr. Morgan in a similar context. I think he fulfilled his responsibility by delivering a lecture here based on facts and information. And I think even Dr. Rasmussen will agree that although he presented us evidence, I don't think that evidence refutes any of the factual information we've seen in the morning lecture. If it does so, I would like to hear about it more specifically.
Thank you, Dr. Benz. I think the response of the audience expresses appreciation of the audience for the presentations that were made by Mr. Ross and Dr. Rasmussen. And now, by virtue of the authority vested in me by the Student Public Health Association, I hereby adjourn this forum.